Hello, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the Ronald Reagan administration. The Reagan administration is most certainly a response to the Carter administration. The Carter administration, most Americans kind of viewed Carter as ineffectual in the economy because of the energy crisis, the high inflation, and soaring interest rates. There's also the sense of weakness in his dealing with the Iranian hostage crisis. And so the reaction against Carter ends up becoming a movement back towards conservatism and Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan is really a pretty interesting character with an interesting background. He started out as a New Deal Democrat in California. He had a B movie career. He gets the nickname the Gipper from one of his most famous roles in Hollywood. Never super famous guy, but B list. People know who he is. And after his movie career is over, he gets a job as like a speaker, and a lot of businesses like hire him to come around and give speeches because he's got great communication skills. One of his other nicknames is the Great Communicator. And while he's in California, he starts to reject a lot of democratic principles. Deficit spending is getting out of control at this point. It's $300 billion annually, which is peanuts compared to what we're doing today. But he's concerned about that, and he's concerned about a lot of the kind of leftist policies that came out of the 60s and the 70s. He really takes a stand against programs like affirmative action that weight the ability to get a job partially on race. And he doesn't really like that idea. He wants to promote traditional kind of conservative social values. Ever since the Great Society, Johnson's Great Society, America has seen a dramatic increase in divorce rates, and it's kind of affecting communities differently. But the number of kids in single parent households is on the rise, and so he wants to push back towards a sense of traditional family values because the statistics are pretty clear. Children being raised in single parent households don't do as well in school and are more likely to get in trouble with the law, not from any fault of the parents, but unsupervised teenagers. They're not going to do their homework and they're going to go out and experiment with their freedom and get in trouble. And so, he's going to push for more, conservative family values. And he's going to be a believer in trickle down economics. His second wife, when he does get elected, his second wife will be Nancy Reagan. So she'll become the first lady. Nancy Reagan is, really going to be famous for the Just Say No program. She's going to, really kind of push this war on drugs mentality. That war on drugs is not going to be successful. Drugs have been around since humans have been around, and it will have some successes. I should be clear here, right? The Just Say No program and the other programs that evolve out of that, will help individuals for sure, but it's not going to eradicate drug use. But one of the more famous First Lady programs. She's also going to be criticized, because she's California. She's a actor's wife, and so she really gets criticized sometimes when the president is a guy that's all against deficit spending and is a believer in trickle down economics and being self-sufficient, relying on yourself and saving and doing those kind of things. And Nancy Reagan, spends quite a bit of money on, living this lavish, like Hollywood lifestyle in the White House. And so she'll be criticized for that. The election of 1980, is when Reagan gets elected. He'll win the Republican nomination. He beat out George Bush. That's H.W. Bush. and who will later be his vice president, Robert Dole and Gerald Ford. And he is running against Jimmy Carter, right? Carter will get a primary challenge from Edward Kennedy, which kind of shows how weak Carter is. And then, we go into the general election, and this is the map, right? Reagan's in the red, Carter's in the blue. It's a blowout. Uh, you know, uh, this is the evidence that Carter's administration was just wildly unpopular in America, and so Reagan essentially sweeps the map here. Now, when he comes into power, he is going to be pushing a conservative agenda. So, why do he win? Well, he promises this new day for America, like the picture there. He promises this new day for America, a return to America as the shiny city on the hill, that American exceptionalism, that we are the greatest nation on earth. We have the most freedom. We have the best economy. We're one of the most diverse nations on the planet. And he says, yeah, we got our problems for sure. And, with diversity comes, problems, racism and things like that. But, he points out that we are the strongest economy in the world. And yes, we do have poor people, but we have the highest standard of living in the world. And, we have, yes, we have a very strong military that has made some mistakes, but for the most part, we have spread democracy and freedom around the world, and capitalism, which has been the number one thing to lift the world out of poverty. Nothing has lifted more people out of poverty in the history of humankind than capitalism, and America has been the force that's spreading that around the world. And so he really talks about American exceptionalism as opposed to what Carter had said about melees, like that in his melee speech, that everything that's happening is because you Americans don't have the spirit to make the necessary sacrifices. So Carter's kind of this Debbie Downer, whereas Ronald Reagan is like, no, you're great, and America's great, and it's time to focus on that. He's going to capitalize on this idea that the New Deal and New Deal-like policies, the Great Society, are wildly expensive and not showing the kind of returns that were expected of them. There's some political reality. Social Security is crazy expensive, but it's also crazy popular. But he's going to say that we should tighten the budget, and if the average American just can't continue to spend money whenever it wants. If the average American family has to budget, then the American government should do the same. It should budget. He's going to win because of the hostage crisis. It makes Carter look weak. The hostages will be released the day Reagan takes over, which is an international signal of Carter's weakness and Reagan's strength in foreign policy. The high interest rates, 14% interest rates during the Carter administration. People are buying homes. It's like purchasing a home with a credit card. That's just costing people thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. That is unnecessary. The energy crisis. Remember, Carter tried to attack the energy crisis on the demand side, saying just use less gas. Well, that has devastating economic effects for the lower middle class and poor families. Reagan will just say, we'll drill more. We'll get more gas. It'll be cheaper. And then that way, everybody, rich people can continue to go on vacations and poor people can get to work. That's going to help them as well. And that's going to create what will later be referred to as Reagan Democrats. There's a lot of hardworking, blue collar Americans that work in factories and aren't your traditional Republican Party members that are going to look at that and say, all that stuff makes sense, right? Like, yeah, look, I get the environment's important, but what's more important is I have to get to work to pay my rent. And, look, America shouldn't be the world's policeman, but we shouldn't allow a country like Iran to manipulate us the way that they've manipulated us. And so, yeah, it makes sense. America should be on a budget. I'm on a budget. And so those people who are traditionally Democrats are going to come over to the Reagan administration. Reagan's one of the few presidents that's going to leave office as popular as he was when he came into office. That almost never happens. And so, it's this coalition that's going to keep him in power. So, an example of Reagan as a great communicator, right, is I got to throw a couple of quotes up here. When he's talking about conservatism, essentially what he says is the government has great intentions, but they almost always poorly execute things. And so, I mean, that's his opinion, not mine. So he tells the American people, well, you want to know what conservatism is? Like, let me explain it to you in a way that everybody understands. Government's not the solution to our problem. Government is our problem. The interest rates that you're paying that are so high and the inflation, that's all because of government regulations and intervention. It's the reason gas prices are so high is because we won't stand up to OPEC, but also because of these environmental regulations on the industry. And if we lessen those and, drill in, different areas that have been closed off before we can get gas prices low, it's the government that did those things. And people are going to listen to that. He's also going to do really a good job of explaining what the difference, complicated things in simple ways, like the difference between a recession and a depression. He famously says, a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, a depression is when you loses your job, and a recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job. That's not true. It's, how many quarters of negative economic growth there are. But nobody wants to hear that. That's boring. And so he's able to explain things to people in kind of a funny and congenial way. So what's Reagan's political philosophy? He believes in budget cuts. He really believes that the government is spending out of control. And when we spend more money than we take in, what we are doing is we're essentially selling out the next generation, right? And so if all these government programs cost more than we make, we borrow money, and at some point we got to pay that money back. And so what we're doing is we're spending that money now, and this is economics 101. Any money you spend now, you can't spend in the future, and when you put yourself in debt now, you got to pay it back in the future. And so Reagan makes the argument to the world or to the American people, that all of this deficit spending that the Democrats are doing, all that is doing is, pushing that burden onto our children and their generation. And so he talks about budget cuts. He talks about tax cuts. This is supply side economics. He makes the argument that if we cut taxes, then people can spend more and save more, which will spur the economy, right? If he'll cut taxes by like 25%. Taxes during this time were significantly higher than they are now. He says, what? If we cut taxes and the average American gets a tax cut in their paycheck, they're either going to save that money, which is good for that family, or they're going to spend it. And when they spend it, businesses will make that money. When they make more money, they'll hire more people, and that'll spur the economy. That is essentially trickle down economics or supply side economics. And Republicans tend to believe in that. Democrats tend to believe, if the government taxes, they'll spend that money, and then that will help the economy. Help the economy too. Which one of those two is true? Both. They both work in different set of circumstances. And so, anytime anybody is out there trying to tell you that, trickle down never works, or, government spending is the only thing that works, or, government spending never works, it's only trickle down, they're trying to sell you an agenda. Both of them work. They work in different situations. Sometimes one works better than the other, but they both work. So he's also going to say at the same time, we need to increase the defense budget, right? We're still fighting the Cold War. The Soviets reply to strength. The Iranians certainly, were, the Iranians certainly responded to strength as well. And so he's going to talk about, peace through strength. Right. Now he'll be criticized for that because what this political cartoon here that we're looking at shows Reagan ignoring the environment, Social Security, and the needs of cities, essentially starving them to dance with defense, right? The bigger girl, well fed department, and so a lot of people will criticize Ronald Reagan for focusing and spending a lot of money on defense when there's things that we need to be focusing on domestically at home. But to Reagan, that makes sense. He thinks you should deregulate those governments, let the market handle it, and entrepreneurs will help spur economic growth that will help all those other issues. Now, what do you believe? Well, it probably depends on which political party you identify with. Now, Reagan, there will be an assassination attempt made on Reagan's life by John Hinckley. This is not a politically motivated assassination. He is going to be shot in the chest by Hinckley. As a matter of fact, I think the bullet hits the ground and ricochets and flattens out and like slides in between his rib. And so, James Brady's also seriously hit. Reagan's not the only guy that's going to be wounded. This is him right before he gets shot. When he gets shot, very quickly they're going to smother John Hinckley, and they're going to get Reagan into the car. They're going to speed him off to the hospital. You can see the Secret Service all of a sudden out of nowhere just has these Uzis. I don't know if that's an Uzi, but some machine gun, whatever. This came out of that suitcase right there. Was not an actual briefcase, machine gun case. But anyway, Reagan gets sped off to the hospital where he will survive. And later we figure out, well, what was Hinckley trying to do? Well, in reality, he was just crazy. He had seen the movie Taxi Driver, 15 times, and just fell in love with Jodie Foster, who was just a kid at the time. She played like a teenage prostitute in the movie. And he thought he could impress her by killing the president, which is weird because how are those two things related? They're clearly not. John Hinckley will later be sent to the asylum to be taken care of. And so, Reagan, when he is in the hospital and is being he's getting ready to go into surgery, and this is like really serious stuff, right? It's the president, he's going into surgery. Reagan is one of our older presidents, and right before he goes into surgery, there's all kinds of surgeons in the room, and right before they put him under, he says, "I sure hope all you boys are Republicans," implying that if they're Democrats, their hand might slip a little bit. And it's just another example of why he's such a good communicator. Guy's got a sense of humor even in a terrible situation. Some of his first words, to his wife, his wife's like, well, Nancy's like, "What happened?" And he says, "Honey, I forgot to duck." Which again, being funny. Told the surgeons, "I hope you fellas are all Republicans." But it's this kind of response that really just kind of makes America like Ronald Reagan. If you just got shot and you can joke around, that's a pretty amazing thing. It reminds me of like Teddy Roosevelt when he's giving a speech, he got shot in an assassination attempt. They tackled the guy, and Roosevelt just continued the campaign speech. He was like, "I'm not going to let a bullet slow me down." Those kind of stories just I think appeal to people. So Reagan will start to pursue what he calls is Reaganomics, is what it gets referred to. He wants to create a deflationary economy, right? Inflation has been a thing, so he wants to make money more valuable, stop the rising prices. He's going to do that by tax cuts. He's going to try and limit government spending and manipulate interest rates. You can do that through the Federal Reserve and the money supply. And so what'll end up happening is the country will be experiencing a recession, but that will increase consumer spending and eventually is going to get the economy back on track. So by 83, the increased spending led to just this huge economic boom. And so it ended up working. Now, there will be critics that argue that it works, when the supply side economics, when you cut taxes primarily on the rich and businesses, the idea is they'll take that money, they'll invest it back into their business, right? And then once they'll invest it in their business by hiring more people, right? So people get jobs, those people have jobs, they spend their money, they spend it at the business, they make more money, and it kind of trickles down like that and just into a cycle. And so it does work in 83. There's no doubt about it. And in general, like I said, it is one viable economic philosophy. But the critics are going to point out that the upper class and the middle class tend to be the ones that benefit the most from that. And so even though the economy is booming, there are going to be critics of this supply side economics. Interest rates will start to drop, no longer 14%. Inflation will lower. Unemployment, companies will start hiring people again. GDP will increase because there's less regulation. We're going to see oil production ramp up, and so those gas prices will start to stabilize as well. We're also going to see events in the Middle East start to take place. The Iranian hostage crisis, that's going to get resolved. Reagan didn't really have to do much with that because, essentially, after Carter failed to get him released, when Reagan takes over, the Ayatollah's like, oop, we're not messing with that guy, and releases the hostages. And so, the day that Reagan takes office, so again, makes Reagan look really strong, even though he made some threats during the camp, veiled threats during the campaign, but doesn't really have to do much other than that. But so as strong as Reagan talks about being when it comes to foreign policy, right, increasing the military budget, how tough he's going to be against Iran, we're going to see he's not completely consistent in that philosophy. A car bomb will go off, killing 17 Americans in the embassy in Lebanon. Lebanon, man, before the essentially the civil war in Lebanon. Lebanon was like the playground for the rich and famous, these beautiful beaches. It was really Western. There was lots of freedom. The economy was booming. But we're going to see that there's a civil war there. It's a really religious war that is going to create some chaos. The car bomb goes off, and you would think Reagan, Ronnie the Ray Gun, right? He would come in and bash some skulls, but that's not what he's going to do. He's actually going to pull out, and so a truck bomb explodes, kills 241 Marines, and what Reagan does is he actually withdraws from Lebanon. And so, we think of Reagan as having the strong foreign policy, and in a lot of cases he does, but he really kind of picks and chooses. And so Lebanon is going to be, kind of one of the contradictions in the Reagan administration. Reagan will take a tough stand with the Russians. He will, through rhetoric, the Soviet Union is failing, right? And we've talked about this in previous lectures, but it's becoming more and more clear. The people in the Soviet Union aren't happy, right? This idea that, equaling out the playing field and making everybody, not giving people equality of opportunity, right? Which is what we believe of in America, right? Everybody has an equal opportunity to do what they want to do and, to make as much money as they can possibly make. In the Soviet Union, it's equality of outcome. It's everybody is going to be on the same level playing field. Well, that de-incentivizes work, right? Why go to college, and become a skilled laborer if you aren't going to get paid more? Why make the sacrifice of all that extra school and why stay late at work? Why, work twice as quick as the guy next to you if you're going to get paid the same as him? I mean, the joke in the Soviet Union amongst the people of the Soviet Union is they'll pretend to pay us and we'll pretend to work. And so the economic system in the Soviet Union is just collapsing, and Ford and Carter and Reagan all have sensed that. And so Reagan is going to take a pretty hard stand. His rhetoric is going to be very tough, and he's going to call the Soviet Union the evil empire. And no doubt there are famines all across the Soviet Union, some of them on purpose, right? I mean, the Ukrainian famine, I mean, that was like the Ukrainian farmers were very successful, and because they were successful, they had more than others, and the Soviets just believed that's theft, right? If you have more than your neighbor, like you're stealing from your neighbor, and so they like forced a famine on them. I mean, it's like, and then the survivors they rounded up and threw in the gulags and used them for essentially prison labor. And so the Reagan calls them the evil empire, takes a very hard stand rhetorically, but then will the start to actually kind of in the back room start to send out feelers, to the Soviet Union to, like essentially extend the olive branch. He'll lift that embargo on grain that happened because of the invasion of Afghanistan. And so huge rhetoric, but also kind of sending out feelers to see if we can, come to some common ground with the arms race and things of that nature. Now, Reagan will win a second term. Call it morning in America, right? I mean, the most hopeful time of the day. And lots of different things will happen during his administration. One of the first things he's got to deal with is a domestic tragedy, which is the Challenger. The Challenger will explode 73 seconds after takeoff. All of America is watching this. They've taken an American teacher, put a teacher on board this plane, and like everybody in America is going to stop to watch this teacher go to space, and the Challenger will blow up live on television. Everybody's watching. It's a huge national event, right? And it becomes this national tragedy. The NASA really knew it was too cold to launch, but because it was this, huge event, they went on with it anyway. And because it was too cold, one of the O-rings broke apart. A couple of engineers actually warned NASA, like, this is a bad idea. But that O-ring, when it broke apart, I guess fuel leaked or whatever, and then kaboom. And so, because of that, there's kind of this reaction against NASA. They almost lost their funding, but they'll survive the event. It's going to be Reagan that is going to, make a national announcement and really kind of bring the country together, because it is such a national tragedy, right? The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for the journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. Right, he honors them and really acts as a healer to this national tragedy. Again, a part of that great communicator. He's also going to be very impactful in the Supreme Court. He will make 4 appointments. One of them is an historic appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor. She becomes the first woman to be a justice of the Supreme Court. That's significant, and a thing that even a lot of intellectuals today fail to recognize. There's a huge following for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the great RBG, all kinds of documentaries made about her and posters. And, if you ask the average American today, they would say that the Democrat Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the first female Supreme Court justice, when in fact it was the Republican appointee, Sandra Day O'Connor, who was actually the first female appointed to the Supreme Court. William Rehnquist will become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Antonin Scalia, who's probably one of the considered to be like the conservative intellectual and the voice for the conservative intellectual movement. This guy is highly controversial. The people on the left just absolutely hated Antonin Scalia. He died just recently. And then Anthony Kennedy. Anthony Kennedy, I think, really is probably the most underrated justice of the modern court. Kennedy's the swing vote. That's why I call him the challenge. Sometimes he votes with the conservative justices. Sometimes he votes with the liberal justices. And I think he kind of represents a bygone era of compromise. And so, again, probably one of the most underrated justices. Then we're going to see foreign policy challenges in the Reagan administration. One of those is going to be the rise of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Libya is a state-sponsored supporter of terrorism and will be all the way up until the 9/11 events of 9/11. And the America is going to end up having to impose sanctions on Gaddafi. And so I mean, he is, because he's a sponsor of terrorism. We put economic sanctions on Gaddafi. We bombed his home. 66 jets bombed military targets within Libya. We try to kill Gaddafi. We don't kill him. We do kill his baby daughter. As she ends up being not war. And so Libya will continue to be a state sponsor of terrorism all the way up until 9/11. They will seek weapons of mass destruction. But after 9/11, Libya just looks at the world and was like, sorry, America, and gives up their weapons of mass destruction programs. But then we unfortunately don't continue to back Libya's government there, and the people of Libya will essentially overthrow Gaddafi's regime. It's going to end badly for him. And so when America finally gets him to do what we want him to do, which will be in the George W. Bush administration, we don't back him up, and we essentially let it be during the Arab Spring, and Gaddafi. I think the most controversial thing that will happen during the Reagan administration is the Iran-Contra affair. Iran has American hostages, and Iran is fighting a war with Iraq at the time, where literally 1 million Muslims are going to die in that conflict between Iran and Iraq, and they desperately need weapons. And America just will not trade hostages for weapons, right? We don't negotiate with terrorists. So what are we to do? Well, what ends up happening is because we find a roundabout way to do that. We see in Nicaragua, the Contras are battling the Sandinistas, and the Democrats in Congress have legally blocked support for the Contras. And so it's illegal to provide support to the Contras. But what we do is, it's going to be the Reagan administration that is going to essentially have Colonel Oliver North here provide aid to them anyway. That aid then will make it back to Iran. And so we go through back channels to get that aid to Iran to get those hostages released. And that gets discovered. And so this is like wildly controversial. It's like, you can't do that. Congress said not to do that. This is, an abuse of power. Well, and it looks like this might derail the Reagan administration because they did do wrong here. Well, I think Colonel Oliver North actually saves the day for the Reagan administration. He essentially goes before Congress and says, I did it. And I did it because I was going to save American lives. And I'm an honorable man. And sometimes in war, you have to make tough decisions. And this is the decision that I made, and I stand by it. And if I have to pay the price for that, then so be it. I don't regret it. I love America, and I will always fight for America. And that's when America kind of said, oh, all right. And so it ends up, even though it is a big deal, right? We never want our presidents to, upset the balance of the checks and balance system, right? The American people kind of don't allow this to become the big deal that initially people thought it was going to be. We're also going to see a change within the Cold War. As a matter of fact, really, we're going to see the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The Cold War will technically end under George H.W. Bush's presidency, which is Reagan's successor. But the beginning of the end starts here. Gorbachev here is the new leader of the Soviet Union, and he starts a policy that is called Glasnost and Perestroika, which is just essentially just means openness and restructure. And so when Gorbachev gets elected, he essentially is saying, we're going to ease relations with the United States, and we're going to start to give our people some more freedoms, economic freedoms, and we're going to slowly start to change our communist philosophy. And so, this is we see a series of summits between the two nations that are going to bring the two nations closer together. And so the Soviet Union won't completely collapse until Boris Yeltsin in 1991. But Gorbachev is the beginning of the end. The symbolic end. This isn't the technical end of the Soviet Union, but the symbolic end of the Soviet Union will be the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Essentially, what happens is there's a puppet government in Eastern Berlin, and there are protests that people want to reunite Germany. And when Gorbachev comes to visit in Berlin, Reagan had just recently given a speech that said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so protests are erupting. People want the wall to come down. And when Gorbachev is there, essentially the government of East Berlin says, what do you want us to do? Like, what's the instructions here? There's still, Soviet guards all along the wall. And Gorbachev gives a really kind of wishy-washy answer. And when he gives a wishy-washy answer, and then just leaves, the American media reports it wrong, right? The status quo is still in place. The wall is up, and there's no free movement from the East to the West. And the people in the East want to get to the free capitalist West. The standard of living is much, much higher over there. And the American media says the Brandenburg Gate is now open. And so the people of East Berlin rush to the Brandenburg Gate. It's the main gate and into West Berlin. And they rush there, and the Soviet troops were not given that order. So they're there with guns, and they're like, at the gate, and they have a choice to make. Do we open fire on the thousands of people that are going to get through? Or do we just let them go through? And the Soviet soldiers, because there's no direction from their leaders, essentially let them go through. And so the Berlin Wall falls because of some faulty reporting by American journalists. This is the symbol of communist oppression and lack of freedom in the world. And it falls because the American media didn't get their story straight. And then, Reagan gets a lot of credit for it. He says, please, tear down this wall. He doesn't say please. He says, tear down this wall very forcefully. The later Gorbachev will say that had no impact in the decision-making process for the fall of the wall. Is he saying that because he's saving face? Is he not? I don't know. I would probably argue it would have happened eventually anyway, but maybe Reagan spurred it up a little bit. But historically, Reagan gets the credit for it. And so the Berlin Wall essentially falls. And after that, they tear it down, and East and West Germany are able to reunite, and we're going to have a reunited Germany. And that's the symbolic end of the Cold War. It doesn't really end from a historian's perspective until Yeltsin in 91 just kind of dissolves the Soviet Union, and it goes back to Russia. Now, I say that ends the Cold War. I would make an argument that Vladimir Putin today, the president of Russia, is still fighting the Cold War in his mind. He's fighting the Cold War against America, but America has just kind of moved on. So that ends our lecture on the Reagan administration. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I will see you again soon.